4 Apache brides were condemned for being barren. Then a lone cowboy took them in. The rifle was still warm when I set it across my knees. Not from firing, I hadn't fired it. Warm from being slung across my back all morning in the August sun, the metal catching heat the way iron does out here in Arizona, storing it up like it means to use it later. I'd been riding the east perimeter checking the fence, which is what I did on Tuesday mornings, which is what I'd done on Tuesday mornings for 9 years, and I was crouched on the rim of the wash with the sun cutting my shadow small and hard behind me when I saw them. I set the rifle across my knees and looked down at the 4 women sitting in the creosote shade, and I thought, "This is none of your business, Cord Haley." I thought that a fair while. The wash ran dry this time of year, a pale scar in the desert floor, maybe 12 feet across, the banks crumbling red clay that flaked off in chunks when the spring floods cut through and left these channels behind. The creosote along the edges was the only green for a distance, and the 4 women had found the thin strip of shadow it offered and were sitting in it the way animals sit in shade when they've learned to conserve everything. They had packs, small ones. One woman had a blanket folded across her knees even in the heat, which told you something about how cold the nights had been for her, or how much she wasn't willing to put down even when she couldn't use it. I watched them longer than was strictly necessary to understand what I was looking at. Then I uncorked my canteen and walked down to them anyway. I came down on the east side of the wash in the open, not trying to be quiet. A man who comes at you from the direction of nothing and doesn't try to hide himself is making a statement before he opens his mouth, and I wanted to make that statement clearly. By the time I reached the bottom, all 4 of them had seen me coming. 3 had gotten to their feet. The one who hadn't, the tallest of them, maybe 30, with high cheekbones and a cut on her left temple that had bled and dried brown in the heat, stayed where she was, and watched me come with the particular stillness of a person who has decided that nothing I could do would make things appreciably worse. I held out the canteen to her. She looked at it, looked at me. Then she took it and drank, not desperately, steadily, like a woman who'd been rationing herself for days and knew exactly how much she could take without tipping from careful into reckless. She handed it to the woman beside her, without looking at me again. That was the beginning of all of it. My name is Cord Haley. I was 41 years old that August, though I'd have guessed 50 if you'd asked me to guess about someone who looked like me. I'd been running cattle in the Tonto Basin for 9 years, which meant I'd spent most of my working life on ground the territory hadn't quite finished deciding belonged to anyone. That suited me. I'd been married once, to a woman named Ruth who had been patient and kind, and who deserved a man who could be fully present in a house with walls and a routine. Eventually, she'd gone east to her sister in Ohio, and I'd let her go without a real fight, which told you something about the kind of man I was. Not cruel, just already gone even when I was standing right in front of you. I had a small place north of the creek, a house that was more of a very determined shack, 2 rooms, a solid stove, a loft I used for storing things I couldn't find other places for, a barn that was better than the house by a considerable margin because I cared about the animals that lived in it, an 80-some-odd head of cattle that I ran with the help of a Yavapai boy named Cutter, who had appeared at my gate one spring afternoon looking for work and never left. Cutter was 17 that summer and possessed of the specific intelligence of a person who has learned that watching is more valuable than talking, and who has learned it early enough that it's become his natural mode rather than a discipline. He had a way of saying nothing when nothing needed to be said that I had come to count on more than I could comfortably explain. What I did not have was any plan to take in 4 Apache women who'd been put out of the San Carlos reservation. But I had found them, and I had walked down. They came with me because I asked them to, and because they had nowhere else to go. I want to be honest about that combination of reasons, because pretending the second part wasn't there would be a lie, and pretending the first part didn't matter would also be a lie, and the truth was both together. Dea, the tall one, the one who had stayed seated when I came down the bank, was the one who spoke English. She told me enough in the first hour to understand the shape of the situation, and the rest came in pieces over the next several days as trust built slowly in the only way it actually builds, which is one small thing at a time. All four of them had been wives. Had been past tense, in the way that word turns when something formal has been done and can't be undone. Apache family structure was something I knew only in the broad strokes, but I understood that in a place where survival was already close work and margins were thin, a woman who did not produce children was a woman whose cost outweighed her contribution in the specific arithmetic of that life. That wasn't meanness. It was the mathematics of a hard place. I didn't say this to Dea because it wasn't my place to say it. I just listened. 3 of the 4 had been formally set aside. The 4th was Siki, 20 years old, small and watchful, with a quality of attention in her eyes that reminded me of certain animals I had known over the years. Not frightened but ready, taking in everything and processing it somewhere behind an expression that gave nothing back. Siki had found out what was coming and had run before they could do it to her, which took more nerve than I had seen in most people twice her age. They had walked 3 days from the direction of the reservation. Away was their direction. That was all the direction they had. Cutter was at the barn when we arrived. He took one look and said nothing, just stepped back to make room and went to get water. I noticed that he was not confused or troubled by what he was seeing, and I noticed the look on his face, the look of a young man who has been displaced and hungry enough himself to understand something about the situation without needing it explained. I killed a chicken that evening. Cutter cooked it, which he was better at than I was. We ate outside because the house couldn't fit 6 people without it being uncomfortable, and we sat on whatever we could find, the porch steps, an upturned crate, a section of rail I'd pulled off the broken fence, and we ate in the way that people eat when they haven't had enough and the food is real. In the morning, I woke up and they were still there. I stood in my doorway with my coffee going cold in my hand and watched the barn in the early light and let the fact of them being still there sit with me a while. They'd had the whole night to go, and they'd stayed, which told me that what they'd weighed on the other side of going, what the territory held for 4 Apache women without a household and without a direction, was worse than the uncertainty of me. Then I went over and told Dea they could stay as long as they needed. She looked at me with a face that had learned to check things before believing them. Why, she said, and it was not quite a question, it was a test. I thought about it a moment, then I said, because nobody else is going to. She held my eyes another second. Then she said something to the others in Apache, and Cutter, who was nearby mending something, went very still in the way he did when something mattered. I asked him later what she'd said. He kept his eyes on what he was doing. She said he means it. The first trouble came inside a week. A man named Rourke from the agency office rode up with 2 others and a set of papers, and the particular bearing of a man who is accustomed to being given what he asks for. He was compact, a little florid, the kind of man who has arrived at authority through persistence rather than stature, and who is therefore more attached to it than the men who were born into it. He told me the women were under agency jurisdiction, and that I was harboring them in violation of territorial regulation. I was standing on my porch. My rifle was leaning against the post to my left. I had not picked it up and I did not pick it up now. I had my thumbs in my belt loops, and I listened to everything Rourke said with the patience I have learned from years of situations where speaking before the other man is finished is a way of telling him his words don't matter. And this was a time when I wanted him to know his words had been heard, because it was going to make what came after cleaner. He finished. He went slightly pink, the way some men do after a speech. I said those women walked off federal land of their own free will. They're on private property. Mine. Show me the statute that says I have to hand them over to you. He showed me the papers again. I told him I'd want to read those carefully, and he was welcome to wait while I did. He did not want to wait. He told me I didn't understand who I was dealing with, and I said that was exactly why I wanted to read the papers. He told me it wasn't finished, and I said I reckon not. Then I showed him a letter from Sheriff Dobbins that I had ridden 2 hours in each direction to obtain 3 days earlier, Because when you are standing between people and harm, you prepare. He read it twice. His color shifted from pink to something else. He said he'd be consulting his supervisor, and I said that sounded right. He wrote out. Over the next 6 weeks, he came back 3 more times. Each time I had something for him, a letter from Carver, who was the county's most useful man for territorial law, a statute reference Carver had found, a survey that put the boundaries of my private land in unambiguous terms. Each time Rourke left angrier than he'd arrived. The 4th time he didn't come, and after a while I heard he'd been reassigned to another district. None of that was heroic. It was the same work as fighting a fence line that fails in the same spot every spring because you haven't taken the time to understand why it fails. You find out why. You fix the actual problem. You do it because the thing needs doing. The women learned the ranch. I had not quite let myself expect that, and I want to be honest about the shape of my expectations when they arrived. I had expected to provide food, a roof, safety, and I had expected them to receive that, and that was more or less the picture I had in my head without fully articulating it to myself. It was the picture a man draws when he has lived alone long enough to forget that other people are useful rather than just present. I was wrong about that, and it took no time at all to find out how wrong. Dea had a gift with horses that went beyond skill into something I didn't have a category for. It wasn't what a trained wrangler does, the specific techniques, the practiced routines. It was something older and quieter than that, something that lived in the stillness she could make in herself and hold until an animal decided there was nothing threatening in her direction. The roan gelding, a big, mean-tempered animal I'd been fighting all summer, the one that had thrown 3 cowhands in sequence and bitten the 4th badly enough that he'd refused to work the horse again. Dea walked up to that roan on her 3rd morning, stood at the fence, and waited. The roan circled, he snorted. He did everything a horse does when he's decided he's not going to cooperate with you. She stayed still. I was 20 feet back with my arms folded, watching, telling myself I was just observing and knowing I was also hoping. The roan circled once more. Then he came to her. She put her hand flat on his neck. He went quiet like something had been switched off. I watched that and thought, she's been doing this her whole life, not with horses. With men who needed to be waited out before they'd accept anything from a woman. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been wrong somehow. She looked at me once, brief and even, and then turned back to the horse. Hosteen took over the kitchen garden. I had been neglecting it for 2 years in the specific way a man neglects something when he's doing it alone, and has stopped believing in the point of effort that only benefits himself. Within 3 weeks of Hosteen taking it in hand, the garden looked like someone had intended it. She knew plants the way I knew cattle, their individual natures, their requirements, when they were struggling, and what they needed to stop struggling. She planted things I hadn't known could grow in that ground, and started teaching Cutter in the patient way of a person who can see that someone wants to learn, and takes that seriously as a reason to teach. She was 45, maybe, and moved with the economy of a person who has been doing hard work for so long that waste of motion has simply been edited out of her. She didn't talk much. She worked. And when she was satisfied with what she'd done for the day, she sat on the bench outside the kitchen door with a cup of whatever was on the stove and watched the light change on the hills to the east. And there was in that sitting a quality of contentment I had not seen in someone at the end of a working day in a long while. Beta worked the cattle. She was 22, the closest to Cutter's age, and she had the rancher's instinct reading the herd, knowing without being told when something was off, coming back from a morning on the range with information I hadn't sent her out to get but needed. She and Cutter developed a shorthand on the ground that was built out of repetition rather than words, the kind of working understanding that takes months to build between 2 people, and that, when it's working, means the cattle are where they need to be before you've had to tell anyone to move them. She had a laugh she mostly kept to herself. It came out when Cutter said something foolish, which was often enough to give you a sense of how often she was almost laughing. I had decided early on not to have an opinion about that, and to hold to that position. And then there was Sicky. Sicky was the last to trust me and the one I was most aware of, which is not a coincidence and which I am not going to pretend it is. 20 years old, small, with a watchfulness that had changed shape since they'd arrived. It was no longer the watchfulness of a person waiting for the threat to reveal itself. It was something else, something more like assessment. She was still watching everything I did, but the question had changed. She wasn't watching to see if I was dangerous. She was watching to find out what I was. I kept noticing. I said nothing, and changed nothing about how I moved through my days, because the only way I knew to answer that kind of watching was to be what I was, consistently, so that the picture she got would at least be accurate. She would be in the yard when I came in from the north pasture in the evenings, not waiting for me, never that overtly, just present, in the way a person is present when they want to be seen without having to ask to be seen, and the visibility is itself a kind of reaching out. I noticed, I held it carefully, I let it be what it was. Briggs was different from Rourke, and the difference mattered. Rourke had papers and a supervisor, and a process he was required to follow, which meant he could be handled with papers and process in return. Briggs had men, and a long and patient sense of how things in the territory were supposed to go, and the belief, the bone-deep, unexamined belief, that things ought to go the way he preferred them. He was the owner of the largest operation in the basin, had been for 12 years, and that kind of duration has a way of making a man feel that the territory itself has gotten used to his preferences. He came to my fence in September on a cool morning, when the light was starting to angle differently, and told me that having those women on my property was creating a situation. I asked what kind of situation. He talked about the reservation families and the agency and the unrest this was causing, and it was a careful speech with a considered structure and the shape of neighborly concern, but underneath the shape was something else, and I have been reading men in open country long enough to feel what's underneath. When he finished, I told him I wasn't moving the women off my land. Something in his face settled in a different direction. You're a lone man on a lone piece of ground, Cord. The territory doesn't always treat that kindly. I said I appreciate the warning, then I told him he could go. He went. And the way he rode out, the set of his back, the particular posture of a man who has not been denied anything in a while and is reorganizing around the experience, told me he had already moved on to the next method. I stood on the porch and watched him go out of sight and thought about what he was capable of and what he was not capable of, and what the space between those two things meant for how I needed to respond. This is the calculation a man makes when he is the only thing standing between something and the kind of harm that comes from accumulated entitlement. You don't overestimate, and you don't underestimate. You think about what the other man is willing to do openly versus what he'll do from a distance, and you prepare for the second kind, because the first kind is manageable, and the second kind is what gets people hurt. I concluded that Briggs was not willing to do anything that would leave a mark that could be traced back to him. He was too comfortable with his own position to risk it in a way that could unravel it. What he would do was work from the side, the agency angle, the social pressure angle, the reputational angle, making life difficult in ways that were individually small and collectively corrosive. That was the shape of it. Men like Briggs rarely come at you directly. They make the ground around you less certain, and they wait. Knowing the shape of a threat is most of the defense against it. That night I cleaned every firearm on the property. My rifle, the old Colt over the fireplace, the .36 I wore on my hip, the shotgun cutter used. I spread them out on the kitchen table and went through each one slowly and completely, the way my father had shown me, which is the way you do it when you're preparing for something and you want your preparation to be real. Cutter watched from the doorway and I told him what Briggs had said, and he listened without expression. The next morning Cutter rode out without telling me where he was going, and was gone most of the day. 2 days after that, a man named Tafoya arrived with his 2 grown sons and spent a week rebuilding the south fence line, which was the fence line that ran closest to Briggs's land. Tafoya asked nothing, charged nothing, drank his coffee in the morning and worked at a steady, unhurried pace and went home each evening and came back each morning. His sons were built like him, big, quiet men who were simply doing a thing that needed doing and required no discussion about why. I shook Tafoya's hand on the last day, and that was the whole of the conversation we ever had about it. Briggs didn't confront me again directly. What he did instead was send his hand deal to town with stories. I know this because Carver sent word, and because the stories had a shape that pointed in one direction. I rode to Sweetwater on a Thursday and sat in the saloon and waited until Deal came in, and when he'd settled and had his first drink, I walked over and sat down across from him. I didn't touch him. I said, "You've been saying things about the women on my land. You're going to stop." He started to explain. I held up one hand. "You're going to stop," I said again, same tone, no louder than before. "And if anyone asks you, you're going to tell them those women are under Cord Haley's protection, that he takes that seriously, that anyone who wants to test it should think carefully about what that means before they do." He was quiet a moment. "We can be two men in a saloon with no particular business with each other," I said, "or we can be something else. Your call." He had his drink. I had mine. He left without looking at me. The story stopped. I won't pretend that was the end of all friction. The territory is not a place where things resolve cleanly into settled situations. There were men over the following months who rode past the property slowly, looking in, men I didn't recognize and who didn't stop to explain themselves. There was a moment in town in November where a man I didn't know said something pointed in my direction at the feed store, loudly enough to be heard, and I turned around and looked at him for a long moment, and he found somewhere else to direct his attention. There were smaller things that added up to a continued interest from somewhere in making me feel uncertain about my position. None of it moved me, not the slow riders, not the man at the feed store, not the 2 occasions when Rourke's replacement came out with a new set of papers and a slightly different argument. I had done the work. I had the documents and the relationships and the reputation, and I had something harder to describe, a feeling of being stood somewhere that was right, that was mine, that I was not going to be walked off of by men whose only real leverage was my own willingness to doubt myself. They couldn't produce that doubt, not anymore. October in the basin, the light going gold and slanted, the desert shifting into the rust and ochre that it keeps all year, but that only shows itself when the harsh white of summer fades. The cattle work moved into fall rhythms, and there was more help than I'd had in 9 years on this place, and everything got done in a way it hadn't been done before, not because I was doing more, but because there were more people doing it, each of them bringing something I hadn't had. It was Hostein's garden that opened things up with Petra Sandoval, who ran the dry goods store in Sweetwater, and who I had always privately judged to be one of the sharpest people in the county, the kind of sharp that comes from work rather than luck. Petra had heard things about the place, the territory talks always, and she came out one Saturday, ostensibly to buy a chicken but actually to look, and she ended up in the kitchen garden with Hostein for 2 hours. They didn't share a common language, but they had a common language, if you understand what I mean, the language of people who work with growing things and know what it means when something is thriving and what it means when it isn't. Petra left with seeds wrapped in a cloth and came back 3 weeks later just to check on the garden, and after that she sent business my way when she could. It wasn't much, each individual piece of it, but it accumulated into a reputation, and a reputation is a practical thing in the territory. It either opens doors or it doesn't. By November, what people said about Cord Haley in Sweetwater had changed. I don't know exactly what they said before. Something about a man who ran cattle and kept to himself and didn't cause trouble. What they said now, what I heard back, in the roundabout way you hear things when you're paying attention, was that Cord Haley's place was running right. That there was a woman out there who could gentle a horse no one else could get near. That the man knew how to handle a situation. That he stood by what he said. That was more than I'd had going into August, and it was enough. The days got shorter and the work shifted, the way fall work does on a cattle operation, the drives in, the mending, the winterizing of the barn and the water lines. I had done all of it alone before or with Cutter, and I had done it adequately. Now it got done the way things get done when there are enough people and each person knows what they're doing, quickly and right. There were evenings that fall that I want to account for because they were part of it too, not the dramatic moments but the texture of the days, which is where a life actually lives. Evenings when the six of us came in at the end of the work, and there was something hot on the stove, which there had not always been when it was just me and Cutter, and we sat around the table in the kitchen that was genuinely too small for 6 people, and we ate and somebody said something and someone else answered it, and the lamp made a warm circle, and outside the desert was going cold and dark, and we were in here, which is a thing I had not had in years in the way I had it now. Dea and I could talk. We talked the way people talk when they've both been doing the same work and are going over the day, the roan's progress, a fence section I was worried about, what the cattle were doing in the north pasture. She had opinions about the ranch that were specific and informed, the opinions of a person who had been looking carefully at a place and understood what it needed. Some of her opinions I disagreed with. I said so. She said so back. We figured out the right answer, which was sometimes mine and sometimes hers and sometimes neither. Hosteen and Cutter had their own conversation about the garden that I mostly couldn't follow, which was conducted partly in Apache and partly in the gestures of 2 people who spend their working days together, and have developed a shorthand that doesn't require complete sentences. What I could follow was the quality of it. Easy, instructive, 2 people teaching each other things. Beta was, in my experience, the funniest person on the property. She said almost nothing most of the time, and then said something that caught you entirely off guard. And there was a moment, just a moment, where Cutter would go very still in the way he did before he started laughing, because he'd learned from experience that she was always at least 3 steps ahead of where she appeared to be. And Siki would sit at the end of the table or near the stove, or wherever the natural arrangement of 6 people in a small space put her, and she would eat and listen and sometimes look at me. I knew when she was looking the way you know when the weather changes, without having to check, without needing to look at the sky. It was something in the air. I did not make a thing of it. I passed the food and answered questions, and when I happened to catch her eyes, I held them for 1 easy second and looked away, and that was all. One evening in late October, Cutter left the table to check something in the barn and Hosteen went with him, and Dea was occupied with a piece of mending, and Beta had fallen asleep against the wall. She did that sometimes, efficiently, the way you fall asleep when you've worked hard enough. And I was at the table with my coffee, and Siki was washing the dishes at the basin with her back to me. She said without turning, "What was your wife like?" It caught me flat. I hadn't talked about Ruth since I didn't know when. Kind, I said, patient, she deserved better than she got. A pause, water sounds, then, what did she get? I thought about it honestly. A man who was always somewhere else, even when he was in the room. She turned around then, just enough to look at me over her shoulder. Her face had the expression it got when she was deciding whether something she was hearing was the whole truth or only part of it. She was very good at that distinction. "You are not somewhere else now," she said. I looked at her across the kitchen. "No," I said, "I'm not." She turned back to the dishes. I drank my coffee. Neither of us said anything else. But the room felt different after it, which is a thing that rooms do when something real has been said in them, and I carried that difference with me out to check the barn before bed and through the night and into the morning. Winter came early and hard. A storm in December that laid down 18 inches of snow in the basin, which was more than I'd seen in years, and we spent 3 days close in, the 5 of us working between the house and the barn, heads down in the wind, getting the animals through it. 3 days of that work teaches you things about people that ordinary time doesn't. You find out if they panic, and if they think about the animal in the next stall before they think about themselves, and if their work holds up when they're tired and cold and can't see an end to it. None of the 4 women panicked. Dea spent the worst nights in the barn with the roan because storms made him dangerous, and she had decided he was her responsibility, And she stayed because she decided that, and she was not a person who revisited what she decided. Hosteen kept the stove, and the food coming with the unshakable competence of a person who has been through worse conditions, and knows that worse conditions are survivable if you just keep doing the thing. Beta and Cutter worked the south pasture twice a day, and came back with ice in their hair and red faces and an identical expression. The expression of people who have done what needs doing and are ready to go do it again when the time comes. On the second night of the storm, I was inside by the stove, mending harness, which is work you can do by lamplight and which there is always some of. Sicky was sitting nearby, not right next to me. Nearby, close enough that the room was different for her presence, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. She had her beadwork in her hands. I had been able to see it for weeks now, the pattern of it, red and white and black, Apache pattern, the kind of work that requires long evenings and good attention and the willingness to start a thing and see it through. It had been going on since the storm started, maybe longer. We weren't talking. The quiet between us had become, over the weeks and months, its own kind of conversation, not empty but occupied, full of the small sounds of two people working and the stove, and outside the wind. She said, not looking up, "You are not afraid of them." She meant work. She meant Briggs and Deal and the agency men and all of it. She had been watching, she had seen all of it, and she had been carrying it in that careful accounting she kept. I thought about her question honestly because it deserved an honest answer. I I said, afraid of getting it wrong, of not being enough. She looked at her hands a moment, then she said, "You were enough." That was all. I kept on with the harness, she kept on with the beadwork, the stove worked. The wind worked at the walls and didn't get through. I've been in a lot of different kinds of quiet in my life. That was the best kind I'd known. The storm broke on the fourth day and we came out of it into a world that was all white and silence, the kind of silence that follows several days of noise, absolute, like the land was catching its breath. The cattle had come through. The barn was intact. The roan had made it and Dea had made it through the nights with him, and when she came out into the post-storm quiet she looked at me across the yard with a look that I read as, "We did that." Not a victory look, just a taking stock look. Two people whose partnership had been tested and had held. I nodded at her, she nodded back. We went and did the next thing. January was quiet. The kind of quiet that only January in the desert has, a specific sparse quality, everything stripped back to the bone of the year. I repaired equipment, worked on accounts, rode the fence lines every few days to check for storm damage. Sicky started coming on the fence rides. Not everyone. And never asked, she would just appear when I was saddling up, and she would saddle Hosteen's horse, and we would ride without discussing it. There is a particular quality to riding beside someone in winter country. You are both facing forward, facing the same direction, and the distance between you is the distance between two horses moving together across cold ground, and it is a companionable distance. You talk, or you don't. When you talk, it's easier, somehow, than talking face to face. There is less pressure in it, the same way it is easier to say certain things in the dark. She told me about herself on those rides in pieces, the way she told me everything, never a narrative, never a full account, but a detail here and there, an image. Her mother who had been good with plants, which is where Hosteen had taught her. A brother who had gone to work for a trading post when she was 12 and who she had not seen since. The particular and specific fear of the week before she ran, when she had known what was coming and had been deciding whether she had it in her to go. I asked her once what had decided it. She thought for a while, watching the horse's ears. Then she said, "I did not want someone else to decide what my life was." I thought about that for the rest of the fence line. What I didn't tell her, because I didn't have the language for it yet, was that I understood that from the inside, that the thing that had kept me from going back to try for something better after Ruth, that had kept me solitary on this ground for 9 years, was something related. The fear of being decided about. Of being the man someone else's story needed you to be. It was safer to be nobody's story at all. What the women on my land had done, and what Sicky had specifically done, was make that position cost something. You couldn't be nobody's story when someone was watching carefully enough to see you, actually see you, and to make a choice about what they found. I was not nobody's story anymore. I want to say something plainly about what those women gave me, because I've had time to think about it and I want to get it right. When I walked down into the wash that Tuesday morning, I thought I was doing something for them. Taking in strays, you might say, if you were being uncharitable, and a few people in the territory said exactly that and meant it unkindly. I prefer to say I was doing the decent thing, because a man who walks away from 4 women in a dry wash in August in Arizona isn't a man I'd want to be. But decent is not the whole story. What they gave me I didn't know I was missing until I had it, which is often the way with the things that turn out to matter most. I had maintained this ground alone for 9 years, the cattle, the fence lines, the water rights, the small ongoing battles of a man keeping a place running, and I had done it competently. But I had done it the way you do things when the only stake you have is your own survival. Competent, careful, and entirely without the particular quality that comes from doing things that matter to more than just yourself. When Rourke came and I stood on my porch and sent him away with his papers, I was standing between him and something. When I sat down across from Deal in the saloon, I was protecting something real, something that lived on my land and had placed a kind of trust in me that I had not earned yet but was determined to earn. That's a different kind of man it makes you. You stand up straighter. You think more clearly. You know exactly what you are and what you're there for down to the bone. There is no uncertainty about it. Dea gave me back a horse I'd half given up on. Hosting gave me a kitchen worth sitting down in. Beta showed me that the work I'd been doing alone could be done better with a second capable set of hands beside me, and there was no shame in that. It was just the right way to work the land. Those 3 things were real and good, and I don't want to rush past them. And Sicky gave me the strange and entirely unlooked-for experience of being known, not for what I'd done for them, for what I was. The specific man, the one who wakes before light and checks the animals first, and finds it difficult to explain himself and reads documents twice and cleans his guns when he's worried and stands where he's decided to stand and does not make speeches about why. She saw all of that. She had been watching for long enough and carefully enough that I think she saw it more clearly than I saw it myself. And she wasn't troubled by it, and she wasn't looking past it for something she'd prefer. I had been seen before, but not quite this accurately. There's a difference between a person who sees you and a person who sees you right. There is a thing that happens to a man who has spent years being useful but not noticed, not unloved, not mistreated, just unremarked upon. You do the work and the work gets done, and nobody particularly takes stock of the man doing it, because the work is the point. I'd been that man for a long time. I told myself it was enough, the work. I told myself I didn't need the other part, which is what you tell yourself when you've stopped believing the other part is available to you. What Sicky did was notice the work and the man doing it both. She distinguished between the two. She wasn't grateful for the shelter and attaching that gratitude to me. She was watching the man move through his days, the decisions he made when nobody was checking, the way he treated the animals, the way he held himself in front of Rourke and Briggs and Deal, and she was forming a judgment about the person. An accurate judgment, rendered slowly and then held. That's not a small thing to have done to you. It changes the way you stand in your own life. I will not try to make it smaller than it is. What I want you to understand is that when she put that beadwork in my hands in the February morning and said what she said, we stayed because you were worth staying for, she was not giving me something I'd earned by being their protector. She was telling me something she'd concluded about who I was. Those are 2 different things. One is payment. The other is a gift. She gave me the gift freely. That's the only way a gift like that works. February. The worst of the winter breaking. The sky, that hard clear blue that only shows up when the air is cold and utterly still, and there is nothing between you and the light. I was at the water trough before full daylight, breaking the crust of ice that had formed overnight with the back end of an axe handle. Ordinary work. Work you do by feel more than thought. Work that leaves your hands occupied and your head quiet. I heard steps in the snow behind me and turned. Sicky. She was wearing the dark wool coat I'd given her in December. A coat I'd bought 2 winters before for myself and worn maybe twice, too broad in the shoulders for her, and she'd never done a thing to change it, just pushed up the sleeves and left the shoulders as they were. She had something in her hands. She held it out to me. The beadwork. The band she'd been working at through every long winter evening, finished now. I could see it was finished. Red and white and black in a pattern that was Apache, but that had something of this ground in it too. The colors of the desert after rain. Colors I had been looking at for 9 years, and that she had been looking at for 5 months, and had already understood well enough to put into her work. I took it, I held it. I looked at it for long enough that the looking became a statement. I looked up at her. She held my eyes, and what was in hers was something I hadn't quite seen before, or that I'd been watching build for 5 months and was now simply fully there, visible and certain. Not soft. That's not the word. Clear. Warm and completely decided, the look of a person who has taken the time to think something through all the way and has arrived somewhere and is not leaving. She said, "You gave us a place." She put one hand flat on the beadwork briefly. "This is so you know, we did not stay because we had to." She found the words she needed. "We stayed because you were worth staying for." My throat did what it does when something true lands hard, and your body knows it before your head catches up. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been less than what the moment was. She reached up and put her hand on my face. Not tentative, steady, deliberate, the way she did everything, the way she had accounted for me all those months completely and with her full attention. Her palm was warm even in the cold morning air, calloused from months of work on this ground, and she looked at me the way you look at something you have decided on without reservation, something you have looked at carefully and chosen without being pushed to it. I put my hand over hers. We stood in the cold February morning, with our breath making pale smoke between us and the beadwork in my other hand. She looked at me like I was someone worth looking at, which is a thing I had not felt directed at me, not like this, not this accurately, in more years than I was going to count. I looked back and I did not flinch from it. I'll tell you how it settled, because it matters that it settled well. Dea stayed. Within a year, she was the person most of the valley came to with horses they couldn't figure out. She didn't advertise. She didn't need to. Good work in the territory travels the same routes as water. It finds the low places and it spreads. She became, in the quiet way that real authority becomes itself, someone people deferred to on the subject of difficult animals. There were men who rode 2 days to bring her a horse and went home with something they could actually use. The roan, in the end, became the horse I trusted most on the property, steady, responsive, willing, which was a transformation I would not have believed possible, and which was entirely her work. She eventually built herself a small structure at the edge of the property, separate from the house, her own space, her own rhythm, her preference. I helped her build it. It took us most of a weekend and we talked about horses the whole time, and it was some of the best conversation I'd had about the animals in 9 years of running them. Hosteen stayed. Her garden became, over 2 growing seasons, a thing that people came to see. Petra Sandoval sent people out there who had questions about growing in the basin, and Hosteen answered those questions in her patient, wordless way, and the knowledge she had carried all the miles from the reservation took root in this ground and grew. She knew things about this desert that nobody around here knew, plants that the Apache had used for generations, their properties, their seasons. Some of it I couldn't begin to understand. Some of it, she taught me. The bean she'd brought in that cloth pouch spread across 3 gardens in the valley within 2 years, and when people asked where it had come from, Petra Sandoval told them, and they started coming to the place north of the creek with a different kind of regard than they'd had before. Hosteen was the one, I think, who understood the most clearly what had been done. She said to me once, early spring of the 2nd year, we were fixing the garden fence and she had more English by then than she'd had before, slow and deliberate, she said, "This is a good place." A pause. "It was good before. It is more good now." She said it the way she said everything, without asking for a response, as a statement about the world rather than a bid for agreement. I said, "Yeah." because that was accurate and she had told me she preferred accuracy. Beta married Cutter the following spring. I had seen it coming since October and said nothing. The wedding was small, the 5 of us in Tafoya and his sons in Petra Sandoval, and a preacher who came out from Sweetwater looking slightly out of his element and did his job with good will. Cutter cried, which I will take to my grave and never mention to him again, and which I respected him for. In the years after, he became the most reliably motivated employee I had ever known, which was a side benefit I hadn't anticipated and which I appreciated. Beta and Cutter had a son in the 2nd year of their marriage. He was a loud, healthy boy with his father's eyes and his mother's way of reading a situation without appearing to look, and they named him after nobody in particular, which I approved of. I taught him to ride when he was 5 and was startled, in the particular way you get startled by children, by how much there already was in him to work with. Sicky stayed. And the ranch changed in the way that places change when they become inhabited rather than merely occupied, when they have weight and warmth, and the trace of people in every room, horses that know voices, a kitchen that smells like something worth coming home to, a barn where the work is done right because the people doing it care what happens to the animals inside it. I ran cattle on that ground for another 15 years. Some winters were bad. There was a drought summer that killed a third of my herd and left me signing papers I hated signing, sitting across the desk from men who had the specific look of people who are glad something bad happened to someone else because it improves their position. There were good years too, years when everything worked, and the cattle came off the summer range fat, and the water ran clear, and the prices held, and the Arizona sky was exactly what it is when it's being generous, which is the finest sky I've stood under. The kind of sky that makes you understand why people have been trying to take this ground away from each other since before anyone can remember. Through all of it, the bad years, the good ones, the in-between years that are most of what a life is, I was not doing it alone. That was the thing that had changed. That was the thing that did not change back. I want to end on a morning, because that's where the truth of a life like mine lives. Not in the moments that you'd put in a newspaper, but in the ones that repeat until they are the substance of the days rather than the decoration. Late spring, maybe 14 months after I found them in the wash. I came out the back door before light with my coffee, the way I always do, and stood on the porch and watched the sky come up over the Mazatzel rim. The mountains go purple before they go gold. There's a few minutes in between where the light is doing something particular, deciding what it's going to be, or finishing the decision. And in those few minutes the whole desert is still, and the colors are colors you can't describe to someone who hasn't seen them. And I have been standing here watching them for 9 years, and I still stop for it every morning, and I think I always will. Sicky came out behind me. She had her own coffee, which meant she'd been up already, which I'd learned meant she'd heard me get up and gotten up herself. Not because I'd asked her to, but because she preferred mornings that began alongside another person. She stood next to me, close enough that I was aware of her the way you're aware of warmth as a presence, as a fact of the air around you. We weren't talking, we were watching the mountains. After a while she said something in Apache, quiet, that I didn't entirely catch. Then she tilted her head toward the mountains, then toward the ranch spreading out below the porch, the barn and the garden and the fence lines and the cattle moving in the early light, and then toward me. "This is good," she said, "all of this." I looked at it, my ground, my work, the thing I had built piece by piece without a plan and that had become, through means I could not entirely account for, something worth having and worth holding on to. "Yeah," I said, "it is." The sky went gold and the day came on, and I set my cup on the rail and went to work, and she was there. That's the whole of it.